14th century was perhaps the worst period in European history to be alive, with an onslaught of climatological disasters as well as plagues that ravaged both the human and domesticated animal populations of the continent. Mortality exploded. Emerging from a time of plenty and steady population as well as economic growth, England and Wales were completely unprepared for what fate had in store for them as the 14th century began. As with the rest of Europe, England had enjoyed the benefits of the medieval warm period from the 9th to 14th century, which is known to us from less than scientific contemporary data recorded in annals, chronicles, rice and harvest records, as well as the simple work of chroniclers. The strongest warming of this period immediately preceded the Hundred Years' War and lasted from approximately 1100 to 1300 CE, with temperatures averaging almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than averages recorded in the 20th century. To supplement this potentially unreliable information that this data comes from, modern historians have relied on the work of a range of scientific fields to glean more accurate data from sources such as dendrochronology, lake sediments, isotope analysis, and radiocarbon dating. Warmer temperatures in Europe were a great boon to the inhabitants of Western and Northern Europe, who were able to cultivate crops nearly 200 feet higher in elevation than in the modern day, with the production of oats, barley, and rye being possible in even the coldest corners of Europe. A traditionally fragile and Mediterranean crop, grapes were cultivated 300 miles north of even those most northerly cultivation areas today, with English production and trade of wine competitive with that of France. The great European forests that dominated the landscape were also cut away from more land to cultivate and graze upon, and the efficiency of existing lands was increased as new technologies led to far better yields. All of this is to say that the capacity for European agriculture in the centuries preceding the environmental catastrophes on the eve of the Hundred Years' War was the highest it had been and would be for centuries. While the human population was soon to be ravaged by the Black Death, livestock populations had already been racked with two plagues of their own, known as sheep scab from 1279 to 1280, and again in the 1310s, as well as the Great Bovine Pestilence from 1319 to 1320. Similar outbreaks occurred across Northern Europe, as well as regionally across England and Ireland during this period. As a result of the Great Bovine Pestilence, approximately 62% of all bovine animals in England and Wales died, crippling the dairy industry and related economic fields. This can be seen in not only the high mortality rate of the cattle themselves, as well as a sharp decline in price per head, but also in the decline of purchasing of pasturage. The expenditure of one exemplary manorial authority cratered from an average of £5 7 shillings on meadow down to 18 shillings 9 pence. The loss of cattle hampered access to important sources of fertilizer, muscle, for hauling, as well as vital sources of dietary protein, calcium, and vitamin B. The bovine population in England and Wales was so devastated that it did not reach pre-pestilence levels until the outbreak of the Black Death decades later. These diseases were severely damaging to the food supply and economy of medieval England on their own, but these outbreaks coincided with the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which was precipitated by a period of drastic cooling due to the onset of the Ice Age. For up to 100 consecutive days, a continuous downpour fell across England, Ireland, the Low Countries, France, Scandinavia, and Germany, destroying crops and ruining harvests of fodder and foodstuffs. These crop failures also coincided with serious damage to pasturage due to the inclement weather, further reducing the availability of nutrition to the English and their cattle. Yet these weather trends were not consistent, with periods of torrential downpour followed by dry and warm years leading to a series of bad harvests, occurring all throughout the 14th and 15th century. Average temperatures in Europe became 1 degree Celsius colder, with growing seasons in Europe shrinking by up to 3 weeks and reducing the altitude limit of crop and tree cultivation by as much as 656 feet due to increased snowfall and glacial advance. This major increase in cold all but eradicated the domestic English vineyards, of which there had been at least 50, and forced the wine trade to be restricted to one of the last holdings of the English crown in France, Gascony, which would be the flashpoint where the 100 Years' War would begin. The Little Ice Age would have had an immeasurable yet still tangible impact on many aspects of daily life beyond the catastrophic damage to food supply in general. With colder average temperatures came much more brutal and oppressive weather, leading to tremendous storm swells that swept away hundreds of thousands of people along the coasts of the Low Countries and Germany well into the 16th century. Economic damage was obviously severe, as major industries such as the unmatched English wool trade were impacted from nearly every angle. This industry was also a major factor in the relationship between England and the Low Countries, as they were leading producers of textiles, thus highly dependent on English export. Malnutrition also meant less productive and less available labor, causing economic unrest across Europe. From 1315 to 1316, agricultural yield declined as much as 40 to 45% in the south and 72 to 89% in the north of England. These critical areas of nutrition, grain and dairy, contributed 70 to 80% of daily caloric intake and 10 to 15% of daily caloric intake, respectively, and would have drastically weakened the overall health of the English population, leaving them critically vulnerable to diseases of all forms. According to Philip Slavin, this tremendous decline in food supply led to the deaths of about 10 to 15% of the entire European population before the plague even came to English shores. This disastrous shift in the availability of the food supply was recorded by Johannes de Trocolo in his Annotates. His description of food prices gives us a clear idea of the massive inflation of the value of these goods due to their scarcity. In the year of our Lord, 1315, apart from the other hardships with which England was afflicted, hunger grew in the land. Meat and eggs began to rot out. Capons and fowl could hardly be found. Animals died of pest. Swine could not be fed because of the excessive price of fodder. A quarter of wheat or beans or peas sold for 20 shillings. A quarter of salt was commonly sold for 35 shillings, which in former times was quite unheard of. The land was so oppressed with want that when the king came to St. Albans on the feast of St. Lawrence, it was hardly possible to find bread on sale to supply his immediate household. He continues, considering and understanding these past miseries and those that were still to come, we can see how the prophecy of Jeremiah is fulfilled in the English people. If I go forth into the fields, behold those slain with the sword. And if I enter into the city, behold them that are consumed with famine. Going forth into the fields, when we call to mind the ruin of our people in Scotland and Gascony, Wales and Ireland, entering the city we consider them that are consumed with famine. And when we see the poor and needy crushed with hunger, lying stiff and dead in the wards and streets. 4 pennies worth of coarse bread was not enough to feed a common man for one day. The usual kinds of meat, suitable for eating, were too scarce. Horse meat was precious, plump dogs were stolen, and according to many reports, men and women in many places secretly ate their own children. The breakdown in food supply would have seriously undermined English unity and helped to set the stage for the later peasant revolts that would rack the countryside during the 100 Years' War. With the economy in shambles, price fluctuations became such an issue that the crown attempted to directly intervene in the costs of goods through a proclamation by Edward II. This feeble effort could do little to assuage the damage, however, as labor and food shortages could not be so simply solved. This crisis prompted the crown to issue their royal response to this famine. It reads, Edward, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Aquitaine, to the mayor and sheriffs of London greeting. We have received a complaint of the archbishops, bishops, earls, barons, and others of the commonalty of our kingdom, presented before us and our council, that there is now a great and intolerable dearth of oxen, cows, sheep, hogs, geese, hens, capons, chickens, pigeons, and eggs, to the great damage and grievance of them and all others living within the said. We therefore have ordained, in our last parliament held at Westminster, that a good saleable fat live ox, not fed with grain, be henceforth sold for 16 shillings, and no more. And if he have been fed with corn and be fat, then he may be sold for 24 shillings, at the most. And a good fat live cow for 12 shillings, fat hog of 2 years of age for 40 pence, a fat sheep for the wool for 20 pence, a fat sheep shorn for 14 pence, a fat goose in our city aforesaid for 3 pence, a good and fat capon for 2.5 pence, and so on. And if any person or persons are found unwilling to sell the said goods at the settled prices, then let the goods be forfeited. Here, the crown shows a desire to control prices and control the food supply, thus, at least in some way, assuring that some people will be fed better than the market may provide. As for the impact of plague, many of the results of such a devastating epidemic are quite obvious. Populations already racked by famine and suffering en masse from malnutrition died by the scores. In England alone, the population fell from around 4.8 to only 2.6 million from 1348 to 1351. This initial wave of plague, known popularly as the Black Death, was not the only one, however, as it became endemic to Europe, contributing to further inhibition of demographic development and outbreaks stretching from 1370 to 1520. This is seen through the decline of England's population from 2.5 to 3 million over this same period, down to 2 to 2.5 million. A cycle of plague and recuperation occurred in intervals of 5 to 10 or 12 years, often due to a mix of climatic conditions as well as human immunity. While epidemics following the initial arrival of the Black Plague typically were more regional, they were still devastating, especially when outbreaks coincided with periods of famine, which luckily happened surprisingly infrequently. Regardless of the coincidence of the two factors, however, human development spans much more than the period of a single harvest. Thus, a good harvest during a plague year is no guarantee of health and proper development. That being said, according to Kathleen Pribble, absence of cold weather is one of the primary known factors contributing to the potency and likelihood of a plague outbreak. Warm temperatures and summers with either average or below average rainfalls occurred simultaneously, with 17 outbreaks of plague from 1361 to 1500. This long-lasting demographic stagnation due to the regular culling of the English population had serious socioeconomic consequences as well. Labor shortages began to emerge all over Europe as the mass deaths in the countryside and urban centers eradicated entire communities. This labor shortage put large amounts of stress on the social order and economy of most of Europe, as suddenly the surviving peasantry became far more valuable. In absence of germ theory, medieval people believed that plague resulted from a concept known as miasma, or bad air. Naturally, paranoia in this time of crisis became rampant, and people everywhere looked in Europe for who was to blame for such a catastrophe. Thus, many in Christendom turned to one of the most distrusted minorities among them, the Jews. Following the so-called poisoning hypothesis, inquisitions began in Switzerland under the authority of Amadeus VI, Count of Savoy. These inquisitions produced false confessions, such as this one made under duress by a Jew named Agime. The following confession came at the hands of the authorities of Strasbourg. To begin with, it is clear that Lent just past Pultus Classis de Rans had sent us this very Jew to Venice to buy silks and other things for him. When this came to the notice of Rabbi Perret, a Jew of Cambrai, who was a teacher of their law, he sent for this Agime, for whom he had searched, and when he had come before him, he said, "We have been informed that you are going to Venice to buy silk and other wares. Here I am giving you a little package of half a span in size, which contains some prepared poison and venom in a thin sewed leather bag. Distribute it among the wells, cisterns, and springs about Venice and the other places to which you go, in order to poison the people who use the water of the aforesaid wells that will have been poisoned by you, namely the wells in which the poison will have been placed." Agime took this package full of poison and carried it with him to Venice. But when he came there, he threw and scattered a portion of it into the well or cistern of fresh water, which was there near the German house, in order to poison the people who used the water of that cistern. And he says that this is the only cistern of sweet water in the city. He also says that he mentioned Rabbi Perret promised to give him whatever he wanted for his troubles. This confession and others like it led directly to the live cremation between 900 to 2,000 Jews in Strasbourg. While these confessions are clearly false and to a modern reader were obviously made under duress to create a scapegoat, they were enough to convince most Europeans. The first and second waves of plague were defined by a firm belief in environmental poisoning, whether due to conspiracy or by other means. Thus, anti-Semitic attacks spread across Europe along with the false words of these confessions. Unfortunately, this was not the beginning, nor the end of paranoid attacks against vulnerable groups like the Jews in this period, as calamity and paranoia gripped all of Europe throughout the 14th century. The 14th century was a time of tremendous environmental catastrophe in Europe, especially in England and Wales. With human economies and food supplies entirely at the mercy of nature, the extreme vulnerability left millions of people essentially defenseless against the onslaught of these crises. Cycles of intense and unpredictable weather, as well as outbreaks of plague in both human and domestic animal populations, precipitated mass death and deprivation. Economic and social damage was immense, and recovery from this period would take over a century. Thank you for watching.